If you have ever been told that you do not matter, that the years you gave, the work you did, the quiet loyalty you showed meant nothing, then this story is for you. Because today, I want to tell you about a woman named Marta Backwood, 67 years old, who spent most of her life behind a desk in a courthouse that most people forgot existed. She filed documents. She organized records. She kept the machinery of justice turning in a small American town for over 4 decades. And she did it without complaint, without recognition, and without anyone ever once saying thank you. And when that courthouse was modernized, when the county decided it was time for new computers and young faces and glass doors that opened with key cards instead of keys, they looked at Marta and told her she was too old to keep up, too insignificant to be missed. They handed her a cardboard box. They walked her to the door. And just like that, 41 years of invisible labor vanished like dust from a filing cabinet. But what happened next, what Marta found hidden beneath the floorboards of her family's old attic, would force an entire town to face the truth it had buried for generations. And when the people who had dismissed her came crawling back, begging her to be quiet, begging her to hand over what she had found, she looked them in the eye and said, "No. If you are new here, welcome. And if you have been with us before, welcome back." Before we begin, do me a small favor. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and leave a like. Your support helps us bring more stories like this one to people who need to hear them. Now settle in. This one will stay with you. To understand what Marta Backwood found in that attic, you have to understand the life she lived before she found it. Marta was born in 1959 in Grayfield, a town of roughly 4,000 people tucked into the low hills of Western Virginia. It was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where the same families ran the hardware store and the funeral home and the law office on Main Street, where the courthouse stood at the center of town like a cathedral, old and gray and unshakable. Marta's father, Arthur Backwood, had worked as a maintenance man in that courthouse for 30 years. Her mother, Helen, took in sewing from the women on the hill, the wives of judges and bankers and selectmen, pressing their linen and hemming their curtains, and never once sitting down at their tables. Marta grew up understanding a simple truth. Some people ran the town, and some people served it. The Backwoods served. They were good at it. They were proud of it, and no one ever thanked them for it. She was a sharp girl. Her teachers said so. She read everything she could find in the Grayfield Public Library, which wasn't much, but she read it twice. She had a gift for organization, for remembering names and dates and connections between things. Her high school guidance counselor once told her she had the mind of an archivist, and Marta carried that word around like a jewel in her pocket for years, turning it over in quiet moments. Archivist, someone who preserves what matters. But there was no money for college. Arthur's pension barely covered the mortgage on the family house, a narrow 2-story frame house on Birch Lane, built in 1927, with a sloping porch and an attic that smelled of cedar and old wool. Helen died of pneumonia when Marta was 19. Arthur followed 3 years later, his heart giving out on a Tuesday morning in the courthouse boiler room, still wearing his work boots. Marta was 22, alone, no siblings, no savings beyond what her parents had scraped together for burial costs. The house was paid off. That was the one mercy. But the roof leaked, the furnace rattled, and the wallpaper in the upstairs bedroom was peeling away from the plaster like dead skin. She needed a job. The county clerk's office was hiring a records assistant. The pay was $11 an hour in 1981 money. The work was filing, indexing, cross-referencing, pulling old case files for attorneys who couldn't be bothered to learn the system themselves. Marta applied and was hired the same afternoon. The clerk who interviewed her, a heavy man named Gerald Briggs, looked at her application and said, "You're Arthur's girl, aren't you? He was a good man, quiet, never caused trouble." That was the highest praise the backwoods ever received in Grayfield. They never caused trouble. And so Marta became a records clerk. She sat behind a wooden desk in a basement office that smelled of mildew and toner ink, and she filed. She filed deeds and liens and probate documents and court transcripts. She filed marriage certificates and death certificates and restraining orders. She filed affidavits, depositions, motions to dismiss, motions to compel, amendments, appendices, supplements. She filed the town's entire legal memory, year after year, decade after decade, until her fingers developed calluses from the edges of manila folders and her back curved into the shape of her desk chair. She became, without anyone noticing, the most knowledgeable person in the building. Attorneys called down to the basement when they couldn't find a precedent. Judges sent their clerks to ask Marta for files that the digital system couldn't locate. The county administrator relied on her to pull historical records for grant applications and zoning disputes. She knew where everything was. She knew who had sued whom in 1974, which properties had changed hands during the tax crisis of 1989, which families had filed complaints against which officials, and when, and why. She knew the town's secrets better than anyone alive. But knowing secrets and being valued for knowing them are different things. To the people upstairs, the judges in their paneled chambers, the attorneys in their pressed suits, the administrators with their budgets and their 5-year plans, Marta was furniture. She was the woman in the basement. She was the one you called when you needed something and forgot the moment she delivered it. For 41 years, Marta arrived at 7:30 in the morning and left at 5 in the evening. She ate lunch alone at her desk, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, an apple, a thermos of coffee with 1 sugar. She never married. There had been a man once, in her early 30s, a surveyor named Dennis, who came through Grayfield for a state project. They had coffee 3 times at the diner on Oak Street. He asked her to come with him to Richmond. She thought about it for 2 weeks, standing in the kitchen of the Birch Lane house at night, looking at the dark windows of the houses across the street. She decided she couldn't leave. The house, the job, the town that needed her even if it didn't know it. Dennis sent a postcard from Richmond. She never wrote back. She filed the postcard in a shoebox in the hall closet and closed the door. The years passed. The courthouse was renovated twice. Once in 1996, when they installed fluorescent lights in the basement, and again in 2011, when they upgraded the plumbing and added an elevator. Each time, Marta packed her files into boxes, moved to a temporary desk in the hallway, and moved back when the work was done. Each time, no one asked her opinion about the renovation. Each time, she adjusted without complaint. She watched younger clerks come and go. Some lasted a year, some lasted 5. None lasted as long as Marta. None understood the filing system the way she did. When the county switched to a digital records management platform in 2015, Marta taught herself to use it by reading the manual 3 times over a weekend. She entered every record by hand. She cross-referenced every digital file with its physical counterpart. She caught 14 data entry errors that the vendor's team had missed. The county administrator at the time, a woman named Sharon Greeley, sent her a form email thanking her for her attention to detail. That was the closest thing to recognition Marta ever received. Then, in the spring of 2026, the county board approved a full modernization of the courthouse. New servers, new software, new staff. The building would be gutted and redesigned as a 21st century civic hub. The basement, Marta's basement, would become a fitness center for county employees. The notice came on a Tuesday. A woman from Human Resources named Kelsey, who was 31 years old and wore a lanyard with the county logo printed on it, sat down across from Marta's desk and slid a single sheet of paper across the surface. Ms. Backwood, as part of the Courthouse Modernization Initiative, your position has been eliminated effective the end of this month. You'll receive 2 weeks severance and information about COBRA health coverage. We appreciate your years of service. Marta looked at the paper. Then she looked at Kelsey. 41 years, Marta said. Kelsey smiled the way people smile when they have been trained to smile. We understand this is a transition. There are resources available. I built the filing system, Marta said. I built it from nothing in 1981. Every record in that database went through my hands. And we're grateful for that contribution. The new system will. Who will know where anything is? Kelsey's smile held. The new team will be trained on the digital platform. Everything is in the cloud now, Ms. Backwood. It's all very streamlined. Marta looked at her desk, at the pen holder her father had carved from a piece of cherry wood, at the calendar pinned to the wall with notes in her own handwriting, depositions due, filings pending, records requested, at the basement that smelled of mildew and toner ink and 41 years of her life. Is there anything else I should know? Kelsey asked. Marta picked up the penholder and put it in her bag. No, she said. I believe you've said everything. The first week after the termination, Marta didn't leave the house on Birch Lane. She sat in the kitchen in the morning and stared at the wall where the clock ticked too loudly now that there was no morning routine to fill the silence. She made coffee and didn't drink it. She opened the refrigerator and closed it. She stood in the living room and looked at the furniture that hadn't changed since her mother was alive, the brown corduroy couch, the oval mirror above the fireplace, the brass lamp with the dented shade. She was 67. She had no pension, just Social Security that wouldn't start for another year, and savings that amounted to less than $9,000. The house was hers, but the roof still leaked and the furnace still rattled, and now the water heater was making a sound like a small animal trapped inside it. There was no family nearby, no friends really, not the kind who call. The women at church nodded when they saw her. The cashier at the grocery store knew her name. But there was no one who would notice if Marta Backwood simply stopped leaving the house. She had become, she realized, exactly what Kelsey from Human Resources had implied. Insignificant, replaceable, gone without a ripple. On the 9th day, Marta decided to clean the attic. She had avoided the attic for years. It was her parents' space, boxes of Arthur's old tools, Helen's sewing patterns, moth-eaten quilts, a broken rocking chair that had belonged to Marta's grandmother. The cedar smell was thicker up there, almost suffocating, and the single bare bulb cast shadows that made the boxes look like crouching animals. She started at the far wall, pulling boxes into the light, opening them, sorting. Her father's work boots, cracked and stiff, her mother's reading glasses in a leather case, a stack of yellowed newspapers from 1977, a cigar box full of buttons. She was about to close the last box when her foot caught on something, a floorboard, loose, tilted up at one corner. She knelt down and pulled it away. Beneath it, Wedged into the space between the joists was a metal box, not a shoebox, not a tin, a proper lockbox, the kind people used for important documents, with a rusted latch and a small keyhole caked with dust. It was heavy. She carried it downstairs to the kitchen table and set it under the brass lamp. The latch gave way with a screwdriver and patience. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded blue cloth, were dozens of letters, yellowed envelopes, some sealed, some opened and refolded. Marta counted them. 43 letters spanning what appeared to be 4 decades, from the 1960s to the early 2000s, all written by women, all addressed to the same person, Judge Harold P. Whitfield. Harold Whitfield. Marta knew the name the way everyone in Grayfield knew the name. He had served on the county bench for 32 years, retiring in 2003 to a standing ovation from the Bar Association. His portrait hung in the courthouse lobby. Silver hair, stern jaw, American flag pin on his lapel. He had died in 2014 at the age of 88. The town had named a park after him. His grandson now sat on the city council. Marta opened the first letter. It was dated June 1967 and written in a small, careful hand on lined paper torn from a notebook. It began, "Dear Judge Whitfield, I am writing to you because I have no one else to write to, and because I believe you know what happened to my sister." Marta read the letter. Then she read the next one. Then the next. She read for 4 hours, sitting at the kitchen table while the coffee went cold and the light outside turned from gold to gray. And by the time she reached the last letter, dated September 2001, written by a woman named Clara, whose handwriting trembled so badly the words ran together, Marta understood what she was holding. These were not ordinary letters. They were testimonies, pleas, accusations, written by women from Grayfield and the surrounding towns over several decades. Women who had witnessed things, suffered things, discovered things. Women who had tried to report misconduct, corruption, coercion. Women whose complaints had been dismissed, whose cases had been buried, whose voices had been erased from the record. And every single letter pointed in the same direction, toward the powerful families of Grayfield and the system that protected them. Toward Judge Harold P. Whitfield, who had not merely failed to act, he had actively suppressed evidence, manipulated proceedings, and ensured that certain people were never held accountable for the harm they caused. The letters described land seizures disguised as tax sales, custody rulings that punished mothers who spoke up, complaints against officials that vanished from courthouse files, witnesses who were threatened, women who were told, in person and in writing, that if they persisted, they would lose everything. Marta sat at the table with her hands flat on the surface, the letters spread before her like a map of decades of buried suffering, and she thought, someone collected these. Someone saved them. Someone put them under the floorboards of this house. Her father, Arthur Backwood, the maintenance man who walked the hallways of that courthouse for 30 years, who fixed the locks and mopped the floors and emptied the trash, and who, it seemed, had also collected the letters that powerful people wanted to disappear. He had gathered them quietly, one by one, over the years. He had hidden them in the one place no one would think to look, beneath the attic floor of the Backwood house on Birch Lane. Arthur Backwood had never caused trouble, but he had kept the evidence. The next morning, Marta called the only person she could think of, Ruth Henley, the retired town librarian. Ruth was 74, sharp as a tack, and the only person in Grayfield who had ever spoken to Marta about anything other than file requests. They had shared coffee at the library circulation desk a handful of times over the years, usually after Marta had come in to research historical records. Ruth knew the town's history, the official version and the whispered one. She had spent 40 years cataloging the archives and had seen enough discrepancies to develop what she called a healthy suspicion of consensus. Ruth came to the Birch Lane house that afternoon. She sat at the kitchen table and read the letters in silence for 2 hours. When she finished, she took off her reading glasses and set them on the table and said, "Marta, this is real. I know it's real. This is dangerous. I know that too." Ruth picked up the letter from Clara, the last one, the one with the trembling handwriting, and held it like something fragile. Some of these women are still alive, or their children are, their grandchildren. These families are still in Grayfield. The Whitfield grandson sits on the city council. Yes. If you go public with this, they will come after you. Marta looked at Ruth. Who will come after me? I am a 67-year-old woman with no job, no pension, and $9,000 in a savings account. I have nothing left for them to take. Ruth studied her for a long moment. Then she smiled, a thin, determined smile that Marta had never seen before. Then I suppose we should find someone who knows the law. The someone turned out to be a young woman named Jenna Reeves. She was 29, freshly certified, working out of a borrowed office above the hardware store as the town's first legal aid attorney in 15 years. She had moved to Grayfield from Baltimore 3 months earlier, following a posting nobody else wanted, and she was still learning which streets went where and which doors to knock on. Ruth brought Jenna to the Birch Lane house on a Thursday evening. Marta served coffee in 3 mismatched cups and laid the letters out on the dining room table, all 43 of them arranged chronologically. Jenna read them in silence. She took notes in a legal pad. She asked questions, careful, specific questions that told Marta she understood what she was looking at. When she finished, she sat back in her chair and exhaled slowly. "This is a pattern," Jenna said. "Not isolated incidents. A pattern of suppression that spans decades. If even a quarter of these claims can be verified, this is..." She paused. "This is significant." "Significant enough to matter?" Marta asked. "Significant enough to shake this town to its foundation." But first, they needed proof beyond the letters themselves. Letters were testimony, not evidence, at least not on their own. They needed to trace the families, verify dates, names, case numbers, find the court records that should exist and the ones that didn't, build a timeline, build a case. This was where Marta's 41 years in the courthouse basement became something more than invisible labor. She knew the filing system. She knew where records were kept and where gaps existed. She knew which files had been moved, reclassified, or quietly removed over the years. She had noticed these gaps for decades, small irregularities, folders that were thinner than they should have been, index entries that referenced documents no longer in the cabinet. She had never understood the pattern. Now she did. The 3 of them, Marta, Ruth, and Jenna, worked for 6 weeks. Ruth tracked down the families through library archives, genealogical records, and the kind of stubborn door-knocking that only a retired librarian with 4 decades of community knowledge could accomplish. Jenna filed public records requests and compared what the county provided with what should have been there. And Marta did what she had always done. She organized. She cross-referenced. She built a master index of every letter, every name, every date, every missing file, every discrepancy. She was not a detective. She was not a lawyer. She was a records clerk. And it turned out that a records clerk was exactly what was needed. Word of what they were doing reached the fourth member of the team before they reached him. His name was Marcus Cole, 35, a podcast producer who ran a small independent studio out of his apartment and had been looking for a story that mattered. He showed up at Marta's door on a Saturday morning with a recording microphone and a genuine curiosity that Marta recognized immediately. Because it was the same curiosity she had carried her whole life, the archivist's hunger to know what really happened. Marcus didn't just want to broadcast the letters. He wanted to interview the families. He wanted to record the voices of the daughters and granddaughters of the women who had written those desperate words. He wanted to give them names and faces and stories, and he wanted to do it carefully, responsibly, with Jenna's legal guidance and Ruth's historical context and Marta's meticulous documentation holding the whole thing together. It was not easy. Some families didn't want to talk. Some had left Grayfield decades ago and had no desire to revisit what had happened. Some were afraid, and some, more than Marta expected, were grateful. Grateful that someone had finally found the letters. Grateful that someone was finally listening. Grateful that someone believed them. But not everyone in Grayfield was grateful. The first warning came in the form of a phone call. A man's voice, calm and measured, told Marta that she was stirring up things that were better left alone, and that people with long memories don't appreciate being reminded of unpleasant history. The second warning came from a visit. Bradley Whitfield, the judge's grandson, city council member, real estate developer, knocked on the door of the Birch Lane house on a Wednesday afternoon. He wore a blue blazer and a practiced smile. He told Marta he had heard she had found some old family papers and that, as a matter of respect for his grandfather's legacy, he would appreciate the opportunity to review them. He implied that the letters were private correspondence that belonged to the Whitfield family and that keeping them could be considered, he chose the word carefully, inappropriate. Marta stood in the doorway of her house, her father's house, her mother's house, and looked at Bradley Whitfield and felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear, something harder, something older. The same thing she had felt when Kelsey from Human Resources slid that termination paper across her desk. The same thing she had felt every time an attorney called the basement without saying please, or a judge's clerk picked up files without saying thank you. "Mr. Whitfield," Marta said, "these letters were written by women from this town. Women who asked for help and didn't get it. Women whose names were erased from the record. These letters don't belong to your family. They belong to theirs." She closed the door. The third warning came from the county administrator's office, a formal letter requesting that Marta return any county property that may have been inadvertently removed from courthouse premises. Jenna responded with a legal brief that made the administrator's office very quiet, very quickly. But Marta did not sleep well those weeks. She lay in her bed on Birch Lane and listened to the house settle and creak around her and thought about her father. Arthur Backwood, who had walked those courthouse hallways for 30 years, who had swept the floors and fixed the hinges and emptied the bins, who had never raised his voice or filed a complaint or caused a single moment of trouble. He had seen those letters. He had found them, or they had been given to him. Either way, he had understood what they meant, and he had made a choice. He had preserved, them. He had not been able to speak up. Perhaps he had been afraid. Perhaps he had not known who to trust. Perhaps, in a town where the people who ran things were the people the letters accused. There had been no safe place to bring the truth. But he had saved it. He had tucked it beneath the floorboards and trusted that someone, someday, would find it. That someone was Marta. The podcast launched on a Tuesday morning in late summer. Marcus called it The Letters of Grayfield. The first episode was 42 minutes long. It opened with Marta's voice, quiet, clear, steady, reading the first line of the first letter. Dear Judge Whitfield, I am writing to you because I have no one else to write to. By the end of the first week, the podcast had been downloaded 12,000 times. By the end of the first month, it had been featured in 3 regional newspapers and a national legal blog. By the end of the second month, the state attorney general's office had opened an inquiry. What happened next happened quickly. County records were subpoenaed. Gaps in the files, the same gaps Marta had noticed for years, were identified and documented. Former court clerks, now retired, gave depositions confirming that they had been instructed to reclassify or remove certain documents. A forensic archivist brought in by the Attorney General's team described the pattern as systematic suppression of public records over a period of at least 30 years. The Whitfield family issued a statement calling the allegations baseless and motivated by personal grievance. Bradley Whitfield resigned from the city council 2 weeks later. His resignation letter cited a desire to focus on family matters. 3 families named in the letters filed civil suits. 2 more contacted Jenna's office with stories of their own, stories that had never been put in letters, that had lived only in memory, passed from mother to daughter like heirlooms. No one wanted, but no one could throw away. The town split. Some people praised Marta. Others cursed her name. An anonymous letter appeared in her mailbox calling her a troublemaker and a bitter old woman with a grudge. But for every hostile letter, there were 5 kind ones. From strangers, from out of town, from women her age who wrote things like, I never had anyone to tell. Thank you for telling for us. Ruth Henley organized a community meeting at the library. 73 people came. Some stood and spoke. Some sat and wept. Some simply listened. Marta sat in the 3rd row and did not speak at all. She did not need to. The letters were speaking now, and they were louder than anything she could have said. 6 months after the podcast launched, on a cool evening in early autumn, Marta was sitting on the porch of the Birch Lane house when a truck pulled up to the curb. It was Frank Novak, a retired electrician who had been doing quiet repair work on the house since the summer. After he heard about the leaking roof from Ruth at the hardware store. He was 69, broad-shouldered, soft-spoken, the kind of man who showed up without being asked and left without expecting to be thanked. He had rewired the kitchen, patched the porch railing, and replaced the water heater that had been moaning like a wounded animal since March. He climbed the porch steps with 2 paper bags from the diner on Oak Street. Burgers and coffee. He set one bag on the railing in front of Marta and sat down in the other chair, the one that used to be Arthur's, and looked out at the street without saying anything for a while. Heard the Attorney General's report comes out next week, he said finally. So I'm told. Going to be a lot of noise. There's already a lot of noise. Frank nodded. He sipped his coffee. You know, my mother used to clean houses for the Whitfields, back in the 70s. She never talked about it much, but she once told me that the people who run a town and the people who know a town are never the same people. He paused. I think she would have liked you, Marta. Marta looked at him. This quiet man who had fixed her roof without being asked, who brought her dinner without making a fuss, who sat on her porch as if it were the most natural thing in the world. and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not love, exactly, not yet, but the possibility of it, the warmth of being seen by someone who didn't want anything from her except her company. "I think I would have liked her too," Marta said. They sat on the porch and ate their burgers and watched the street darken and the first stars appear above the rooftops of Birch Lane. The Attorney General's report was released on a Thursday. It confirmed what the letters had alleged: a pattern of record suppression, procedural manipulation, and institutional failure spanning more than 3 decades. The report did not name Judge Whitfield directly. He was dead, beyond prosecution, but it named the system he had built and the people who had maintained it. It recommended legislative reforms, reparative measures for affected families, and a permanent public archive of the recovered documents. The Grayfield Courier ran the story on the front page. The headline read, "Hidden Letters Expose Decades of Corruption in County Courts." Beneath the headline was a photograph of Marta Backwood standing on the steps of the courthouse. The same courthouse that had fired her 6 months earlier, the same building where she had worked in the basement for 41 years. She was wearing a gray cardigan and holding a folder against her chest. She was not smiling, exactly. But her chin was up, and her shoulders were straight, and her eyes were looking directly into the camera with an expression that anyone who knew her would not have recognized. It was not defiance. It was not anger. It was certainty. The certainty of a woman who had finally been told she mattered, not by one person, but by an entire chorus of voices that had been silenced for decades and were now, at last, being heard. The county offered Marta a formal apology. She accepted it with a handwritten note, 3 sentences long. The county offered to name the new courthouse archive after her. She declined. She asked them to name it after her father instead. The Arthur Backwood Memorial Archive opened the following spring. It occupied 2 rooms on the ground floor of the renovated courthouse, the same building, different purpose. Marta was invited to serve as its first volunteer curator. She accepted. She arrived every morning at 7:30, just as she always had. She sat at a desk near the window, not in the basement this time, but on the ground floor, with sunlight and a view of the park where children played. She organized records. She cataloged documents. She answered questions from attorneys and students and historians who came to study what had happened in Grayfield and how it had been uncovered. She did what she had always done. She preserved what mattered. But now people knew her name. Now people said it with respect. Now, when someone walked into the archive and asked for help, they looked at Marta Backwood and saw not a piece of furniture, not a relic of a bygone filing system, but the woman who had given silenced lives their names back. Frank came by most afternoons with coffee from the diner. Ruth dropped in every Thursday with new research and old gossip. Jenna stopped by whenever she needed historical context for the cases that were still unfolding. Marcus was recording a 2nd season of the podcast, this time interviewing the descendants of the families who had been affected, building a living oral history that would outlast all of them. On the mantelpiece of the Birch Lane house, next to her mother's reading glasses and her father's carved pen holder, Marta had placed a single framed photograph, the one from the Courier, the one of her standing on the courthouse steps. Not because she was proud of the photograph, exactly, but because every time she looked at it, she remembered something important. She was not too old. She was not insignificant. She had never been. And so here we are. If you are sitting somewhere right now, wondering if your years of quiet work ever mattered, if anyone noticed, if anyone will remember, I want you to think about Marta Backwood. Think about a woman who filed papers in a basement for 41 years and was told she was nothing. Think about what she found under the floorboards of her father's house. Think about what she chose to do with it. She did not become someone new. She became, at last, who she had always been, a keeper of records, a protector of truth, a woman who understood that the things we preserve, the letters, the names, the stories, are the things that survive. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is not the one with the title or the gavel or the corner office. Sometimes it is the one who knows where the files are. Sometimes it is the one who was quiet long enough to hear what everyone else was too busy to notice. Marta Backwood heard, and because she heard, an entire town was forced to listen. If this story reminded you that your voice matters, that your work matters, that you matter, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment with one word that describes how this story made you feel. Subscribe if you haven't already, and ring the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Because together, we prove something every single day. Something that Marta learned on that autumn evening, sitting on her porch with a cup of coffee, watching the stars come out above the rooftops of a town that had finally begun to tell the truth. Dreams don't age. They wait. And when it's time, they rise. See you in the next story.